When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect little slice of peace. The houses were neatly lined up, the lawns manicured, and the streets quiet except for the occasional sound of kids playing or a dog barking in the distance. After years of renting cramped apartments in the city, this suburban cul-de-sac felt like a dream come true. I finally had my own space, my own yard, and the sense of calm I had been searching for. For the first few weeks, I kept mostly to myself. I worked from home, so I didn't have much reason to be out and about unless I was walking my dog or doing yard work. I waved to neighbors when I passed them, smiled politely, and tried to blend in without drawing too much attention. Everyone seemed friendly enough, at least, almost everyone. There was one neighbor who stood out, and not for the right reasons. Her name was Karen, though I didn't know it at the time. She was the type of person who always seemed to be watching, lurking behind her curtains or standing in her yard with her arms crossed like a self-appointed guard of the neighborhood. While others greeted me with a wave or a quick chat, she gave me only sharp glances, as though I had already broken some unwritten rule. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just cautious around new people, I told myself. Not everyone warms up right away. I figured, given time, she'd come around. But even in those early days, I could sense something about her was different. The way she scowled at the moving truck when it blocked the street for a few hours. The way she frowned when she saw me planting flowers that weren't the exact same variety everyone else seemed to have. It wasn't just watchfulness, it was disapproval. Still, I was determined not to let it bother me. I had worked too hard to buy this home and start fresh to let one unfriendly neighbor sour the experience. I spent those first weeks settling in, setting up my little office by the window, getting to know the layout of the neighborhood, and exploring the nearby park with my dog. But even as I settled in, Karen's presence seemed to hover like a storm cloud on the horizon. I would catch her staring when I mowed the lawn, as though she was keeping track of the exact height of my grass. One afternoon, when I left my trash can at the curb a little longer than usual, I noticed her taking photos with her phone. When I waved at her, she didn't wave back. It was odd, but not yet enough to worry me. Every neighborhood had one person who liked to nitpick, right? I told myself to ignore it. After all, I had bought this home to enjoy some peace and quiet, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me. Little did I know, this was only the calm before the storm. It didn't take long before Karen finally made her move. Up until then, she had been nothing more than a pair of glaring eyes across the street, silently judging everything I did. But one morning, as I was pulling weeds from the flower bed in front of my porch, I heard the sharp clack of sandals on the sidewalk. I glanced up, and there she was, marching toward me with a clipboard in hand. Her lips were pressed tight, her brow furrowed in permanent disapproval, and even before she spoke, I had the uneasy feeling that I was about to be scolded. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clipped and authoritative. "Do you live here?" I blinked, confused. Yes. I bought the house last month." Her eyes narrowed, as though she didn't believe me. "I see. Well, I'm the head of the HOA here, and I need to inform you that your trash cans were left out past the acceptable time yesterday. Pickup is at 7 a.m., and all containers are supposed to be brought in by noon. You didn't bring yours in until after 3. For a second, I thought she had to be joking. She was actually keeping track of the exact hour I pulled in my trash cans? But her expression was deadly serious. "Oh, I didn't realize," I replied carefully, trying not to escalate. "I'll make sure to bring them in earlier next time." That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't finished. She glanced at the flower bed I had been working on and pursed her lips. "And another thing," she continued. "Those flowers you planted, those aren't on the approved list for front yards. We like to maintain a uniform aesthetic in this community. Only certain shrubs and seasonal flowers are permitted. You'll need to remove those and replace them with something more appropriate." I felt my patience waver. "These are just marigolds," I said, wiping dirt from my gloves. "They're not exactly wild weeds." Her expression hardened. "Rules are rules. Everyone has to follow them, otherwise the neighborhood loses its charm. I suggest you review the HOA handbook immediately." With that, she scribbled something on her clipboard, tore off a sheet of paper, and handed it to me like a police officer issuing a ticket. "Consider this your first violation notice," she declared. "We'll let it slide with just a warning this time, but repeated offenses will result in fines." I stared at the slip of paper in disbelief. A violation? For marigolds and a late trash can? This was my first real encounter with Karen, and already it felt like I was being put on trial for crimes I didn't even know existed. She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, leaving me sitting on my front step with the warning slip in my hand. My dog barked from inside, sensing my frustration, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Still, a part of me knew this was only the beginning. Karen had drawn her battle lines, and whether I liked it or not, I had just become her next target. After that first confrontation, I tried to shrug it off. Every neighborhood had someone like Karen, someone who craved control and thrived on making others miserable. If I ignored her, maybe she'd get bored and move on. But ignoring Karen turned out to be impossible. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed her constant presence more and more. It was like she had appointed herself my personal watchdog. Whenever I stepped outside, whether to mow the lawn, water the flowers, or take my dog for a walk, I could feel her eyes on me. Sometimes she would stand at her window, peeking through the blinds. Other times, she would linger on her porch with her arms folded, pretending to sip from a mug while glaring in my direction. Then came the notices. At first, it was small things. A note tucked under my doormat telling me that my lawn appeared uneven. A slip taped to my mailbox reminding me that sidewalk chalk is not permitted on driveways. Once, she even left a printed letter accusing me of parking too close to the curb, as if such a thing were a crime. It didn't take long before I had a small stack of her passive-aggressive paperwork. My neighbors started to notice too. One evening, while I was taking out the trash, a man from 2 houses down approached me. His name was Dave, and he gave me a sympathetic look. "Don't let her get under your skin," he said, jerking his head toward Karen's house. "She's been like this for years. You're just the latest one on her list." I frowned. "So it's not just me?" Dave chuckled bitterly. "Oh no. She's harassed half the street. Last month, she tried to find me because my son left his basketball hoop in the driveway overnight. And she nearly lost it when the Johnsons painted their front door red. She thinks being HOA president gives her the right to control everyone's lives." His words were both comforting and concerning. Comforting because it meant I wasn't crazy, Karen really was targeting people. Concerning because it meant this wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Sure enough, Karen escalated further. She began documenting my every move. I caught her snapping photos of my car one morning as I left for work. Another time, she filmed me with her phone as I trimmed the hedges, muttering something about property standards. It was ridiculous, and yet, somehow, it was intimidating. It's one thing to have a nosy neighbor, it's another thing entirely to have someone weaponizing HOA rules and collecting evidence against you. I thought about confronting her, but something held me back. Maybe it was her smug confidence. Maybe it was the fear that she'd twist anything I said against me. Either way, I decided to bide my time. Still, a knot of frustration was building inside me. The final straw of this chapter came late one evening. I had left my living room blinds open while watching TV, and when I turned my head toward the window, I saw her, standing on the sidewalk, staring straight inside my home like she had every right to. That was when I realized, this wasn't just about trash cans or flowers anymore. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was obsessed. And people like that? They don't stop until something, or someone, forces them to. For weeks, I had been putting up with Karen's constant hovering, her fake violation notices, and her obsessive need to monitor everything I did. But everyone has a breaking point, and mine finally came on a Saturday afternoon. It was one of those rare perfect days, warm sun, a cool breeze, and no work deadlines hanging over my head. I decided to invite a couple of friends over for a backyard barbecue. Nothing wild, just 3 people, some burgers, and music playing quietly from a Bluetooth speaker. About an hour in, as we laughed and flipped burgers on the grill, I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I turned, and sure enough, Karen was standing in her driveway, hands on her hips, glaring at us like we were committing a felony. At first, I ignored her. My friends noticed but brushed it off. But the longer she stood there, the more uncomfortable it became. It felt like we were being stalked in our own backyard. Finally, Karen marched over, not bothering with pleasantries. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you realize you're violating at least 3 HOA rules right now?" I set down the spatula and sighed. "Karen, we're just having a few friends over. We're not disturbing anyone." She jabbed a finger toward the speaker. "Noise restrictions. No outdoor music after 5 p.m. unless it's pre-approved by the HOA board." I checked my watch. It was barely 3:30. It's not even close to 5. Her face flushed, but she wasn't backing down. She pointed at the parked cars along the curb. "And those vehicles. Guests aren't allowed to park overnight on the street. This is exactly the kind of behavior that lowers property values." My friend Mark, who doesn't have much patience for nonsense, muttered, "Lady, we've been here for an hour. Chill out." Karen's eyes widened as though he had just cursed at her. She gasped dramatically. "Excuse me? You do not talk to me that way. This is my neighborhood. I keep things in order around here." That was when my patience snapped. "Karen," I said firmly, locking eyes with her, "this is my house, my yard, and my life. You don't get to dictate who I invite over or what I do on my property, especially when we're not breaking any real rules." For a second, I thought she might back down. Instead, her lips curled into a smug smile. "Fine," she hissed. "If you won't listen, I'll let the police handle it." And with that, she stormed off toward her house, pulling out her phone as she went. My friends looked at me in disbelief. "She's not really calling the cops, is she?" one of them asked. I shook my head slowly. "Oh, she's calling. She's the type who lives for this." And sure enough, minutes later, as we sat silently in the backyard, we heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Karen had declared war, and now the law was being dragged into it. The sound of sirens started faint, but they grew louder until flashing blue and red lights painted the street outside my house. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances. None of us had ever had the police show up at a backyard barbecue before. And sure enough, there she was, Karen, standing proudly on her lawn, phone still in hand, waving down the cruiser like she was directing traffic. She looked triumphant, as if she had finally caught me red-handed in some great crime. The officers stepped out, 2 of them, both looking more tired than alarmed. One of them adjusted his belt and sighed like he'd been through this routine before. Karen wasted no time rushing up to them, her words spilling out in a dramatic flurry. "Officers! Thank goodness you're here. This man has been hosting illegal gatherings, blasting music, blocking the street with cars, completely out of control. He's disturbing the entire neighborhood. I demand you shut this down immediately." The cops glanced at us, 3 people sitting quietly in the backyard with half-eaten burgers on our plates and music so low it could barely be heard over the hum of the grill. One of them raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, "this doesn't exactly look like a party." Karen gasped. "It is a party. An unsanctioned gathering. And if you don't take action, you're allowing him to break HOA law and city ordinances. I've documented everything." She waved her phone like it was a smoking gun. The second officer turned to me. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" I nodded calmly, trying to keep my cool. "Of course. This is my home. I invited 2 friends over for a barbecue. We're not being loud, we're not drinking, we're not blocking traffic. We've done nothing wrong." Karen stomped her foot like a child. That's a lie. He's been harassing me for weeks, deliberately breaking rules, mocking the HOA. Harassing you? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Karen, all I've done is mow my lawn, walk my dog, and now have dinner with friends. You're the one taking pictures of my house and leaving fake violation slips. The officers exchanged another look. They weren't buying her story. Ma'am, the taller one said, his voice firm now, do you have actual proof of any criminal activity? Because what I see here is 3 adults eating burgers on private property. Karen's face twisted with frustration. Proof? Of course I have proof. She fumbled with her phone, scrolling furiously through photos of my trash cans, my flower beds, even a blurry picture of me mowing the lawn. There! That's proof. He's dangerous. He's ruining the neighborhood. The officer sighed. Ma'am, those are not crimes. HOA disputes are not police matters. But Karen wouldn't quit. She raised her voice, practically shrieking, you don't understand. He's violating everything. If you won't do your job, I'll call your chief myself. And that's when it happened. Karen's performance was so over the top, so desperate, that neighbors started peeking out their doors. A couple even walked over, clearly tired of her antics. Officers, Dave, the neighbor who had warned me about her before, said, this is ridiculous. He hasn't done anything. Karen's been harassing him since the day he moved in. Honestly, she's been harassing all of us. The cops now had witnesses, and I could see their patience wearing thin. Karen, however, only doubled down, her voice cracking as she shouted over everyone. And in that moment, I realized the tide was finally turning. The police weren't here for me anymore. They were starting to see the truth. Karen wasn't the victim. She was the problem. The 2 officers stood in the middle of my yard, caught between Karen's frantic shouting and the calm reality in front of them. One had his arms crossed, the other was scribbling notes on a pad, but it was clear from their expressions that this wasn't their first time dealing with someone like her. Karen, however, was relentless. I'm telling you, he's dangerous, she barked, pointing at me with her whole arm like I was some wanted fugitive. He's deliberately breaking rules, taunting me, and lowering everyone's property values. I don't feel safe living next to him. I opened my mouth to respond, but the taller officer raised a hand. Sir, let's just go through this step by step. Do you have any ID on you? Of course, I said, pulling my wallet from my back pocket. This is my house. I closed on it last month. You can check the deed if you want. Karen scoffed. Don't believe him. He's probably renting illegally. People like him always lie. The officer shot her a sharp look. Ma'am, let him finish. I handed over my driver's license, and the officer compared the address to the paperwork on his clipboard. Satisfied, he nodded. Checks out. Karen's face tightened. That doesn't prove anything. You don't know what he's capable of. He leaves his trash out, he plants the wrong flowers, That's HOA business, ma'am, the other officer interrupted firmly. Not police business. Do you have any evidence of a crime? Anything at all? Her phone was already in her hand, shaking as she scrolled furiously through photos. She shoved it toward the officer. Look! Look at these! The officer glanced at the screen. One photo showed my trash can by the curb at 1:30 in the afternoon. Another was of my flower beds with the marigolds blooming in bright orange. A third was of me mowing my lawn. He blinked at the images, then looked back at her, clearly unimpressed. Ma'am, this is just a man taking care of his house. That should have been the end of it, but Karen's voice rose higher. You don't understand. He's provoking me. He stares at me, he waves at me mockingly, he lets his dog walk near my yard. At that moment, Dave and 2 other neighbors walked up, arms folded, clearly fed up. Officers, Dave said, his voice calm but firm, she's been harassing all of us for years. She finds people for stupid things, takes pictures of kids playing, and calls the cops every time someone sneezes wrong. Honestly, I'm surprised it's taken this long for you to see it. The officers turned toward Karen again. The taller one spoke slowly, like he was giving her one last chance to come to her senses. Ma'am, it sounds like you're making false reports. That's a serious issue. If you don't stop, there could be consequences. Karen's eyes bulged. Consequences? For me? You should be arresting him. She jabbed her finger at me again, but her voice was shaky now, desperate. She wasn't in control anymore, she was losing it, and everyone could see it. The officer tucked his notepad away and squared his shoulders. Actually, ma'am, if anyone here looks like they're disturbing the peace, it's you. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt since moving in. My friends exchanged glances. Dave smirked. And for the first time since I'd met her, Karen didn't look triumphant, she looked cornered. And that was when everything truly started to unravel. The moment the officer told Karen she was the one disturbing the peace, her expression shifted. That smug superiority she always wore cracked, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. She looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to back her up. But instead, all she saw were neighbors stepping out of their homes, shaking their heads. Dave was the first to speak up again. Officers, this isn't new. She's been at this for years. We've all dealt with her calling the cops, making up fake violations, and threatening fines. It's gotten so bad most of us avoid even going outside when she's around. Another neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, joined in. Last year she reported me because my front door was painted the wrong color. The HOA didn't care, but she kept hounding me until I had to file a complaint. A third neighbor added, she called animal control on my kids because they were playing with our dog in the yard. Said it was a safety hazard. They investigated and laughed in her face. The officers listened closely, their skepticism about Karen deepening with every testimony. One of them finally asked, "Ma'am, is it true you've made repeated complaints against your neighbors over non-criminal issues?" Karen's jaw tightened. They're all lying. They're jealous because I actually care about this neighborhood. Without me, this place would look like a dump. But the neighbors weren't backing down. Dave pulled out his phone and held it up. Here, check this out. I've been saving all the messages she's sent me. Look! On the screen were dozens of texts and emails, each one more ridiculous than the last. Demands to repaint his mailbox. Threats about illegal bicycles in his driveway. Even an email accusing his wife of hanging unapproved curtains. The officers looked at each other, and I could see the decision forming in their eyes. Karen wasn't just a strict HOA president, she was a serial harasser. Still, Karen wouldn't give up. Her face was red now, her voice shrill. You're all ganging up on me. This is harassment. I'm the victim here. The taller officer's tone hardened. No, ma'am. Making repeated false reports is harassment. You've wasted police resources and targeted your neighbors without cause. That's not being a victim, that's being a problem. Karen sputtered, pointing at me again. But he looked suspicious. I saw him, staring at me, and... Living next to someone isn't a crime, the officer cut in. The crowd of neighbors was growing now, some openly filming with their phones. For the first time, Karen didn't look powerful. She looked small, like a child caught in a lie she couldn't explain away. I stood silently, letting the scene play out. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth had finally been dragged into the open, and everyone, especially the police, saw it for what it was. And as Karen's shrill protests grew weaker, I realized something important. The more she fought, the deeper she was digging her own hole. The tension in the air was heavy enough to cut with a knife. Karen stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac, red-faced and trembling, while the officers tried to keep the situation calm. But Karen didn't do calm. You're all against me, she shouted, her voice cracking. This neighborhood would fall apart without me. I'm the only one who enforces the rules. If you people actually cared about property values, you'd thank me." The crowd of neighbors didn't budge. Phones stayed raised, eyes stayed fixed on her, and for once, the whispers weren't in her favor, they were against her. The taller officer stepped closer, his voice firm. "Ma'am, we've heard enough. You've made false reports, disrupted your neighbors, and wasted police resources. This has to stop now." Karen's chest heaved as she looked from him to me. Her glare locked onto me like I was the reason her empire was crumbling. "This is all his fault," she screamed. "He moved in here to destroy me. He's been plotting this from the start." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The absurdity of her claim was enough to make a few neighbors chuckle under their breath. The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, that's enough. If you don't calm down and go inside, we'll have no choice but to take further action." But Karen couldn't stop. It was like she was incapable of letting go of her power trip. She waved her arms wildly, pointing at me, pointing at the neighbors, even at the officers. "You're all in on this. A conspiracy. You're trying to take me down because I'm the only one with standards." Her voice grew shriller, her gestures more frantic. And then, she made the mistake that sealed her fate. When the shorter officer tried to gently guide her away from the crowd, Karen slapped his hand away and shoved his arm. "Don't touch me! You don't tell me what to do!" The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in. The officer's face hardened instantly. "Ma'am, you just put your hands on an officer. That's assault." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. "No, I didn't mean, I was just..." But it was too late. The taller officer reached for his cuffs. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assaulting a police officer and filing a false report." The neighborhood erupted in murmurs. Some people actually cheered. Dave muttered, finally, under his breath. Karen, still sputtering, tried to backpedal. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here." But her words carried no weight anymore. The authority she once held over everyone had evaporated in an instant. And as the officer gently but firmly pulled her arms behind her back, the reality of the situation finally hit her. The woman who had called the cops to punish me was about to be the one taken away. The moment the officer pulled out the handcuffs, the street fell into stunned silence. For years, Karen had been the terror of the neighborhood, writing fake violations, calling authorities, acting like she owned every square inch of the block. And now, right here in front of everyone, the tables had finally turned. Karen thrashed as the officer clasped the cuffs around her wrists. "This is a mistake. You don't know who I am. I run this neighborhood," she shrieked, twisting against the officer's grip. But the officer was calm and steady, like someone who had dealt with plenty of people like her before. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, disturbing the peace, and assaulting an officer. You have the right to remain silent." The words made her flinch. "No! No! I didn't assault anyone. I was defending myself. They're lying about me." She jerked her head toward me, her eyes wild. "He set me up. He's the criminal here. Arrest him." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Dave crossed his arms, shaking his head. Mrs. Johnson whispered, "Unbelievable," while more neighbors pulled out their phones, recording every second. This was the kind of justice they'd been waiting for, and they weren't about to miss it. As the officers began leading Karen toward the squad car, she fought every step of the way. "This is harassment. I'll sue every last one of you. You'll regret this." The shorter officer opened the car door, but Karen planted her heels on the pavement, refusing to get in. "I'm the HOA president. You can't do this to me." That was when Dave, unable to resist, called out from the crowd, "Guess what, Karen? HOA rules don't override the law." A ripple of laughter spread through the neighbors, and Karen's face turned scarlet. Furious, humiliated, and powerless, she finally ducked into the back of the cruiser as the officer guided her in. The door shut with a solid click. The flashing lights reflected in the neighbor's eyes, and for the first time since I had moved into that house, I felt the entire street breathe a collective sigh of relief. People weren't whispering in fear of her anymore, they were smiling, nodding, even clapping quietly. One woman leaned toward me and said softly, "You did us all a favor. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to her." But I hadn't really done anything except stay calm and let Karen destroy herself. She had built her little empire on intimidation and control, but all it took was one afternoon for it to crumble. As the cruiser pulled away, Karen's muffled shouting barely audible through the glass, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My friends patted me on the back, Dave gave me a thumbs up, and the neighborhood, my neighborhood, felt like a much different place. For the first time, it wasn't Karen's kingdom anymore. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. For the first time since I'd moved in, there wasn't a dark cloud hanging over the cul-de-sac. The air seemed lighter, the chatter of kids on their bikes louder, and even the birds sounded like they were celebrating. News of Karen's arrest had spread like wildfire. By breakfast, everyone knew. Some neighbors confessed that they'd been harassed for years, ridiculous fines, late-night phone calls, threatening letters. Others admitted they'd thought about moving away just to escape her constant bullying. But now they were free. At the mailbox, Dave clapped me on the shoulder. "You know, you didn't just help yourself, you helped all of us." Last night was the first good sleep I've had in years without worrying about a citation on my windshield. I chuckled. Honestly, I just stood there. She buried herself. Sometimes, Dave said with a grin, that's all it takes. Let someone like Karen talk long enough, and they'll write their own downfall. Within a week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Karen was officially removed as president, and the relief in that room was palpable. Neighbors volunteered for committees, decisions were made fairly, and for once, nobody was afraid of being shouted down. Walking through the neighborhood after that, people greeted me differently. There were more smiles, more waves. Mrs. Johnson even brought over a plate of cookies as a thank you. "We owe you one," she said warmly. I realized something important. I hadn't just bought a house here, I'd earned a community. And without Karen looming over everyone, this community was ready to grow closer, stronger, and kinder. As for Karen? Word had it she was facing charges and might even be barred from holding any HOA position again. Some said she moved in with a relative across town, others claimed she was still plotting her comeback. But whatever her future held, it wasn't going to be here. One evening, I stood on my porch, watching kids play in the street while neighbors chatted by their driveways. The tension that had once gripped this place was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging I never expected to find. Karen had tried to use power and fear to control us. In the end, she lost everything. And all I had to do was let her own actions catch up with her. The flashing lights from that night still played in my mind, the moment she realized she wasn't untouchable anymore. It was poetic justice. And from that day on, this wasn't Karen's neighborhood. It was ours.